Cool. Pleased to introduce Aidan Feldman, who's director of the TTS Technology Portfolio at the General Services Administration and a longtime friend of the show and DevOps in general. You can find him on Twitter at Aidan Feldman. And Aidan, take it away.
All right, thanks, Peter. Yeah, so before diving in, I was already going to say this feels like a very weird time to be talking about DevOps. It feels hard to care about anything right now. And after this very surreal lead up to doing this talk, that is especially the case. So just want to start off by saying, please take care of yourselves and remember that a lot of things matter that aren't DevOps. So, take care of yourself, take care of your families, etc. I'll try to remember to say that at the end as well. But anyway, trying to get back focused. So my name is Aidan Feldman, and today I'm going to be talking about why. So this is the stairs of my apartment building. As you can see, there are bikes stored down there for the 20 or so units in the building. And the landlord decided to build a bike rack out front, right? Didn't want the storage under the stairs and, worries about fire code and that kind of thing. But what's the problem with this? Well, it turns out there are obviously cyclists in the building, right? There are people who are storing their bikes there, but no one ever asked why the bikes are parked inside. It wasn't a matter of lack of places to lock them up outside. It was that having a rack to lock them to is nice, but it doesn't stop someone from stealing a seat or the bike getting rained on or snow causing rust, these kinds of things. So this was an example of not user-centered approach. In this case, like the tenants not being consulted about what their needs were and money getting spent on the wrong thing. So how do you find out what to build when you are thinking about not bike racks, or maybe bike racks, but also engineering systems? How do you know if what you built is the right thing? The problem is that you really don't. To find out, you really need to spend time with your users. You need to talk to them and, more importantly, listen to them. So this is a screenshot of USA.gov, which is the homepage for the US government. They operate a call center, and internally they host listening sessions so that any staff from a large organization from any discipline can listen and hear phone calls from the public. People might be calling in because they find some government process confusing or because they're in trouble and don't know where to turn. Some companies outside of government, I've heard, require everyone to go on customer support rotation. It's these little things that help remind you and your teams why they're there, right? It's an empathy building exercise so that you're really hearing the problems that people are experiencing. And this is important no matter if you work in customer service or finance or HR or, clean the floors, like anything that relates to the success of your organization. It's important to understand the users and then why all the rest of the organization exists to support them. So how do we incorporate that? So this is an off-cited diagram that you may have seen showing the difference between waterfall on top and agile on bottom. Another way to think about it is that waterfall development, right, waterfall processes are a straight line, whereas agile is curved, right? The diagram here, unfortunately, is a little bit too generous, right? Even in this previous diagram showing the steps building up to a car versus these different sort of iterations at the bottom in terms of agile. So, while agile may feel circuitous and waterfall is a straight line because you know where you're going, the problem is it's usually a straight line to the wrong thing. So if we go back to our diagram, instead of ending up with a car at the end, you actually end up with a tank and you forgot to order the treads. So the problem is the user won't be happy because that is definitely not what they wanted. And maybe even worse, they didn't even need a car which you thought you were building them, because they would have been happy with the bike. Waterfall assumes you will learn nothing after you start. So how do we get to that bicycle? How do we find that sweet spot of meeting user needs, and maybe even saving time and resources that we would have spent building something that's way more complicated, or worse, maybe doesn't even meet the needs. So this is where a minimum viable product comes in, right? But the problem is that you can't just be internal, because then you don't learn anything. The only way to get user feedback is if they have something to give feedback on. This applies whether you're building a platform, something that is for internal users, but they are your users, or if you are building a public-facing site or whatever you're working on, right? The users of the system need to see it and touch it, and you need to then learn from them. So that MVP needs to be live, and that MVP needs to be even smaller than you think it does. So there's this great post called Hello Production, where this author, Pete Hodgson, talked about getting the smallest, tiniest thing possible built, but not just built, like actually deployed. And so you're not just thinking about doing a small iteration in terms of a feature, but you're thinking of exercising the entire process, right? In terms of building out the feature, testing it, having quality assurance if that's part of your workflow, and getting it into production, ensuring that you have the systems there and compliance checks or whatever you need, right? So doing this early exercises that end-to-end process delivery, and will surface things like the compliance hurdles that wouldn't come up until the end if you waited. So you want to learn about these issues as early as you can and build them into your process. And that'll help you learn and not running into those problems later when time is of the essence. So these are problems of scale in a way. So how do we mitigate that? So in terms of time, right? Instead of saying this is something that will be completed in 18 to 24 months, et cetera. New rule, all estimates must be days, weeks, or months. You can tell your organizations that I made you do this. It's not your choice. So these estimates, numbers are not allowed, because software engineers, DevOps people, and humans in general are not good at estimating. And the trick is not to try and get better at estimating. The trick is just to forget about estimates altogether at a higher granularity than days, weeks, or months. So things that are months should be broken down to weeks or days. And with those, you can prioritize some and do the rest later, or not at all. So you might be wondering, and your bosses might wonder, but how do we plan for the long term? Well, this is what requirements documents are for, right? You take that information from leadership and you make it actionable, right? You put it in a written form. Unfortunately, requirements documents are not a vehicle for information. They're an obstacle. Stop writing requirements docs. For the long term, set principles, define problem statements, define your scope, but do not write explicit requirements. The living software is the requirement. So if your dev team is so disconnected from research, from understanding the users, et cetera, that they don't know what to build, then solve that problem. If your leadership is so disconnected from the day-to-day workings of the team actually building the system, and they don't know what's going on there, solve that problem, right? Don't solve it through giant documents. So on the topic of documentation, another new rule, no documents over 10 pages. If you're academic, that's one thing. Your paper is your deliverable. But if you're building software, your deliverable is software. So ship that. As the government digital service in the UK coined, the strategy is delivery, right? It's not valuable unless it's live. So there's a, this is sort of a government-focused stat, but there's this horrifying number, which is only 6.4% of federal IT projects over $10 million were successful. So if you think you're immune from this, good luck. And I am curious how many people here are, have experienced this firsthand. It's probably too many. So new rule is an easy one. No IT projects over 10 million. Just don't do it. Break them into smaller pieces. So this brings us to a new section of technology choices. So in the technology world especially, it's easy to get drawn by new tech thinking it will solve all your problems, right? But if you haven't personally talked to one of your end users in 6 months, please stop talking about AI. If you still have processes that are done on paper, stop talking about blockchain. And if you can't deploy a spelling fix to production in under an hour, stop talking about robotic process automation. These things won't save you from the boring stuff. Be boring. And most solutions are boring, and that's fine. Furthermore, you need to think about maintaining your systems that you already have, as opposed to just, putting spackle over them, because it's just going to add to your problems over the long term. So when you are thinking about new systems, you need to start thinking about maintenance, right? It's important to think about that long term. Well, there's this line of thinking that was summed up nicely by a former colleague, Sarah Allen, in this blog post, and I'll drop the links to all these in the meetup, which is that software maintenance is actually an anti-pattern, because it's not saying that you should stop maintaining your software. It's saying the word maintenance implies a calcification, right? A sort of fixed state of your software, but there should be no done. So from this blog post, Sarah said, software allowed to grow old has created the negative legacy of government software systems we face today. This is because you and your systems are either growing or you're dying. And that doesn't mean the sort of venture capital kind of meaning, which is, that you're growing in terms of money or number of staff or number of users or traffic or these kinds of things, right? Growth can also mean learning and evolving. So that growth comes down to your people, and you have to enable them to do that. So whenever you can, trust the staff, trust the people that are working on these systems, and empower them to do the right thing. So if you're a manager, you need to listen to your staff, you need to get out of their way, and they need to trust you as well. So if you are a manager, be visible, be vulnerable, be a servant leader. Do not sit on another floor in a closed office when we go back to having offices. Hang out, in the chat rooms that they hang out in. Join the silly conversations that, are not just work related. Every policy that you put in place, right? Everything that you restrict them with is telling them, I don't trust you to make the right call. So there are times when policy is warranted, but you should really do so judiciously. It's better to put trust in them and to allow them to make the right decisions, because if people have their heart in the right place, they will. And lastly, find places you can give up control and distribute authority, because that is far more sustainable than trying to centralize it in one person. So talking about platforms, there's a sort of similar mindset of empowerment rather than enforcement, right? And this is hard to do in a government context, but or highly regulated context, I should more broadly. But you want to think about making a golden path that will be fully supported by the org, where people don't necessarily have to use that thing, right? So you're allowing that flexibility, but you want to make it easy on them if they do. So find places where centralization means increased support and not restriction. Set guardrails, but allow for flexibility. In other words, make the right thing the easy thing, right? Bring on inquisitive, dedicated, collaborative, diverse people, empower them, and the rest will work out. So this brings us back to the title slide. And by the way, I'm seeing some things in chat, and I will I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but I'm just going to keep breezing through. So the title slide, I said why, right? This is a reference to the 5 whys exercise, if anyone's ever done that. But basically, when you're trying to solve any problem, if you're building a platform, if you're putting a policy in place, et cetera, you ask why, you get that answer, and then you ask the why beyond that, right? And you continue to dig deeper, and this is really just a way of getting at the root cause, right? It's the reason behind the reason, and this will give you a better understanding of why you're solving that problem, what other problems that maybe you could solve that would alleviate the first problem and make that go away, right? As opposed to just treating a symptom. So cloud, DevOps, CI/CD, these are not the point, right? These are tools. These are meant to serve our users, whoever our users might be. They're just a mechanism. They're a means to an end. They're there to make your teams happy and productive and allow them to focus on solving user needs. They're there to help you move fast and fix things. And if you're in government, right, taxpayers are funding this work. You want to make sure they're getting something out of it sooner than later. And things like continuous deployment allow you to do that. So a recap of the new rules. Estimates must be days, weeks, or months. No documents over 10 pages. No IT projects over 10 million. No user research. Don't get to play with blockchain. And please make sure bike storage is covered. So with that, I can open up to questions. All right, I'm seeing a bunch of things in chat, but I don't know how we want to take the raise hand thing, or
let's to make it go a little faster. How about people put questions in chat, and just to make it sound like a conversation, one of us will read them to you.
Sure.
So
That works.
Victoria, do you want to, for just changing up the voices, do you want to do the reading of the questions in chat? Except I can't unmute her. So I will read the first question. If I can.
Yours are hard, you know?
Yeah. What color was the bike shed? That was from me. You don't have to answer that. Elisa asked, is this a reference to Pentagon Wars?
I've never seen Pentagon Wars and know that I need to. So yeah, that's going to be on the quarantine list for sure. But I know that it's applicable. that's as much as I know about Pentagon Wars.
Okay. Elisa, do you want to try unmuting yourself?
Came and flooded this fucking. Hello.
What?
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm not sure who I unmuted.
I'm unmuted now.
Okay, go ahead, Victoria.
I'm not sure what the last question was, though.
Okay.
Where can one find the Pentagon Wars?
I was wanting Elisa to say more about the Pentagon Wars, but I've not succeeded in muting.
Oh,
there we go.
Yeah, so it's a uncanny reference because it's all about folks in the Pentagon with insane requirements creep, and kind of that whole like waterfall goes to die. And the thing that they're actually trying to build is a tank. So I know Aidan hadn't seen it at one point, but I had to ask again because of the tank infographic.
Yeah, that was just a convenient coincidence. But I've seen a clip, so yeah, I knew there was a tank reference. But no, that was actually coincidental.
Awesome.
But yeah, I need to redo this talk to be Pentagon Wars themed, I think, once I see it.
I'm happy to do that with you.
Perfect.
We can shop it around.
Perfect.
And Banjo has another good question, which I also want to know the answer to. Any strategies for breaking up huge contracts that will be over $1 million?
Yeah. So it's hard, right? Everyone wants you to spend more than $10 million, right? Contracting acquisition is slow. And so you are incentivized to do it as infrequently as possible. And, you know, if you are trying to convince people that Well, yeah, I know you have specific ideas about what this thing is, but we're not going to ask for that specifically in the contract. People are going to say, like, what do you mean? It's, why wouldn't you explain exactly what you want to get as a deliverable, right? If we write out enough requirements, we'll get what we ask for. So the best tangible, and I'm not an acquisition expert, I should say, but having seen, a decent handful of them that are technology related, the best advice I've heard is don't think about it as buying a thing. Think about it as paying for people's time, paying for skill sets, right? So you're not buying a, cloud migration, or you're not buying a benefits eligibility system. You're buying a year of a agile development team, right? And what they get done is what they get done, and your requirements are that they work in certain ways, as opposed to specific things they'll deliver. And that actually gives you more flexibility, because if you're doing these things like user research that teach you things as you go, what you wrote in the requirements document will be wrong, or what you wrote in the solicitation as requirements will be wrong. And so it actually gives you more flexibility. So that's really like the simplest answer I have, which is just think about it in terms of chunks of time, as opposed to a specific deliverable. And like, you can list certain goals, right? Like, listing goals is okay, but not, it will have authentication that has passwords that have this long, many characters, and it will, like, that's way too much detail. So state the problem you're trying to solve, and then state the requirements for how the work is going to be done.
Yeah, and I think there's a balance there, because we recently worked on some contract proposals that have that mindset of, like, we want to buy these skill sets, like this kind of people, their time, but there was so little detail on what the applications were that we're actually supporting that it almost made transitioning, like, the contracting process is still very complicated, but there's a lot of people working to make that better.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to solve contracting being hard, but it's at least going to get you hopefully a better thing through it.
And then, Peter, did you want to read off this question you wrote in the chat, or I can for you?
Yeah, it's kind of close to a rant, but how do we talk to people to get away from, how do we scale up the idea of minimum viable product for applications to minimum viable product for platforms? Because I want to get away from seeing all these agencies producing these multi-page DevOps architecture diagrams that could actually never be built. And if they were built, they wouldn't actually meet the needs of developers who have to use these things.
Well, so it's two different questions, right? So getting away from reference architectures into like actual working systems and software is one thing. And then MVP for platforms is kind of related, but slightly different. So, yeah, like the reference architectures, at best, everyone has to go and re-implement that on their own, right? So we have tools that allow us to define architecture as code, and therefore, like, if you want to replicate it exactly, you can do that. So just do it that way, right? Like, put your reference architecture out there as Terraform or something. So that's like one specific suggestion, right? Is like, forget the giant document, and sure, like, you have a diagram explaining it and like some documentation walking you through, but make it easy for someone to pick it up. If in fact your goal is for people to replicate it, then make it easy for people to replicate it, right? So, not a replacement for documentation, but like, don't let the documentation be instead of actual runnable, configurable, something that you can execute. So to the, what is like MVP for platforms? I mean, it's tough, because platforms sort of by definition are meant to be like all encompassing, right? Like, the whole point is that it does everything for you. But it's hard to, so the trick is like, how can you do just enough, right? And so it's going to depend a lot on your context in terms of like what systems you have available. But let's just say, right, like your current environment is that people spin up virtual machines just raw and then install things by hand. Well, okay, give them a Ansible script that hardens the machine for them, or give them an image that it's really easy to build on top of, or give them a sort of pre-vetted like deployment pipeline that does like sort of automatic staging and rollouts and things, right? It doesn't need to even be a platform in the sense that you're running it, but you could just provide sort of pre-built components and things that make people's lives easier. To find out what those should be, you have to talk to them, as I mentioned before. So Banjo, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right. Did that sort of speak to your, like, what should be documented also? Cool. I can read out the other question. So from Jamie. Hi, Jamie. Isn't this the idea behind managed services from cloud providers? Yes, very much in favor of managed services whenever you can use them. Outsource all that work, right? Let other people take care of the behind the scenes stuff for you. So yes, very much in favor, but they're never going to quite go far enough, right? Yeah, perfect example that came up at work recently was, well, sure, you can use a platform as a service that does your, handles restarts and all the routing and networking, blah blah blah, but it doesn't do anything around your dependencies and checking to make sure those are up to date or that they don't have security vulnerabilities, right? So is that something, maybe that's where our big pain point is, and that's the thing that people are having to reinvent the wheel on. So this is where, it's going to be specific to your context, like where you can provide the most value, but find that like small thing that you can deliver that at the very least people can reuse, if not, make it something that you can actually like host and run for them, so it just works. I'll just keep reading it, the questions, it seems easier. So do these concepts scale to more hierarchy-driven organizations? Are they better suited for flat organizations? Well, the trick is making hierarchy-driven organizations more flat. So, right, the empowerment, like flat organizations generally mean like, I don't have a manager, which is not necessarily a good thing. But the more important nuance there is that people are empowered to do what they think is important, right? And which is not to say you don't have like larger organizational goals, but yeah, that is the point, is that you're doing this to empower people, whether it's through building platforms, whether it's the way that you run your development teams, anything like that.
Awesome. Thank you, Aidan. I think with that, we'll wrap up and say thank you for speaking tonight, and thank you for Peters and others for helping deal with technical difficulties and getting us up and working tonight.
And humanity difficulties.
That too. Peter, did you have any other closing thoughts?
No, thanks for everyone's forbearance, and let's see if we can line up a few short talks for next month if we're all still stuck at home, and hope everyone has a quiet month.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Okay. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.